Monographs, The Value of Reading Old Books. Video and script by Alex Sanderson. This is a discussion of On the Reading of Old Books by C.S. Lewis. The version I read was taken from The Great Tradition, Classic Readings on What It Means to Be an Educated Human Being, edited by Richard M. Gamble, ISI Books, 2007, pages 595 through 600. This video will be divided into 3 segments. The first is Discovery, where I tell the story of how I first came across the work. The second is Synopsis, where I provide a summary of the work. And the third and final segment is Impact, where I muse about how I was personally affected by the work and ask questions like, what did the work cause me to think about? What questions did it raise, and can I begin to answer them? How will or how can the work change my beliefs, worldview, and or behavior? This is the section where I will most likely make amateur attempts to psychoanalyze myself. Part 1. Discovery. On the Reading of Old Books came to my attention because in the collection in which I read them, it preceded The Lost Tools of Learning by Dorothy Sayers, a very excellent essay on education. As for how I found The Great Tradition, the collection of essays in which I read On the Reading of Old Books, it was years ago when I was studying classical education for a paper in graduate school. While searching for books on the subject, The Great Tradition was one that came to my attention. As I enjoy compilations of essays, it was a welcome purchase. According to the introduction in The Great Tradition, On the Reading of Old Books originally appeared as an introduction to a translation of St. Athanasius's The Incarnation of the Word of God, published in 1944. On the Reading of Old Books can also be found in a collection of essays by C.S. Lewis titled God in the Dock. Part 2. Synopsis. C.S. Lewis proposes that reading an old book is much more advisable than reading a new book. On top of the fact that it makes sense to go directly to the source of an idea, for example, read a work by Plato rather than a work about Plato, new books are, quote, still on trial, and the amateur is not in a position to judge it. Lewis explains that books of an older age had their own outlook on the world, their own concerns, their own errors, and their own solutions. Their concerns, their errors, their solutions may not be the same as ours in our current age, and that is precisely why they should be read. Old books will not endanger us to commit their errors because we know their errors, but at the same time they will not, quote, flatter us in the errors we are already committing. In terms of Christianity, Lewis argues that reading older books, whether it's the Puritans, Aquinas, or Dante, will make the reader realize that rather than Christianity being a, quote, word of so many meanings that it means nothing at all, it is rather self-consistent, no matter if you are reading a Puritan, a Thomist, or even an Elizabethan. Sticking strictly to new books will not cause you to have this realization. Lewis finishes the essay by praising the translation and admiring St. Athanasius' ability to write so deeply but simply on the subject of the Incarnation. Part 3. Impact. I was immediately struck by the first paragraph of the book, even the first sentence. Here's part of the opening. There is a strange idea abroad that in every subject the ancient books should be read only by the professionals, and that the amateur should content himself with the modern books. Thus, I have found as a tutor in English literature that if the average student wants to find out something about Platonism, the very last thing he thinks of doing is to take a translation of Plato off the library shelf and read the Symposium. He would rather read some dreary modern book 10 times as long, all about isms and influences, and only once in 12 pages telling him what Plato actually said. I confess I fall into this trap all the time, though possibly for a different reason than Lewis describes of his students. He remarks in the same paragraph that these students are intimidated by coming face to face with a great figure like Plato, and that they will be unable to understand him. My concern, again using Plato, has always been that I would misunderstand him, and that misunderstanding can lay the foundation for serious errors in beliefs, opinions, and outlooks, whether about Plato or about the subjects he addresses. As a result, I haven't read any of Plato's works directly since I took a college course on Plato 10 years ago. I think this way because of what I've read in modern books, and that is, in order to fully appreciate a work, or even just not misinterpret a work, one needs to understand the culture and historical circumstances out of which this work came about. As an example, for years, I've wanted to read Don Quixote, but felt I would not fully appreciate it unless I have a better understanding of medieval European chivalry or the medieval romances that Cervantes parodies. However, I haven't gotten around to reading a book about medieval European chivalry or medieval romances, and it has kept me from reading Don Quixote. Perhaps I need to drop this sentiment and just read the book, and if I misunderstand it or fail to grasp any of the parody, then so be it. There will probably be other aspects of the book I will understand, and that will be sufficient for the time being. Perhaps I need to change the way I think about these old books. I should appreciate them for some other reason than what can I get out of them right now. Maybe I will get nothing out of the book right at this moment. However, weeks, months, or years down the road I will. It could be that I have to stop viewing these books as a means to an end, as tools that I use for some purpose and discard them when I think their usefulness ceases. I believe there are two other reasons for my behavior. The first is I have a compulsion to strive for something akin to intellectual perfectionism. I don't know if that's would be the proper phrase for it. I want to get it right, and preferably the first time, because I don't know when I will be able to get to the work again. There's much to read, and little time to read them. It is one of the curses of the information age for someone of my disposition. I was given the skill of reading, a must for the information age, but skills like discernment and discipline were not cultivated as rigorously as reading was. As a result, I get overwhelmed by the sheer volume of literature available to me between libraries, used bookstores, and ebooks, especially when they're cheap. The second reason deals with my religious faith, particularly when it comes to biblical interpretation. As a text I believe to be inspired by the creator of heaven and earth and all living creatures, I desire to understand it, the Bible, as fully as possible. I also desire to not descend into fundamentalism or believe a false interpretation of the Bible. As a result, I try as best as possible to understand the traditions in the Bible as the original recipients would have understood them. In order to do this, I have to read books outside of the Bible, books on archaeology, history, literary criticism, biblical criticism, ancient culture, ancient historiography, etc., etc. This spills into my habits toward other books, wanting to understand the work as the original recipients understood it, or the original author intended, as best as possible, and in order to do that, I have to read secondary works. This could be the root of my perfectionism, or a symptom of it. Actually, I think it's a symptom of it. The root of my perfectionism probably stems from a period in my life where I was deceived by individuals I trusted. And what's worse, I let them deceive me. And worse than that, when the evidence was staring me straight in the eyes that I was being deceived, I chose to ignore it because of my misplaced trust. When it all fell apart, and I was left reeling in the aftermath, I vowed I wouldn't be so misled again. My perfectionism, my intense desire to get as close to the original meaning of something, came as a result. Moving on, one thing that Lewis does not clarify is what he considers an old book. He doesn't give something quantitative like books that are 50 years older at the minimum. Instead, he just lists a smattering of authors whose works he considers in the category of old books. The majority of the authors he lists died in the 17th century, for example, Richard Baxter, John Bunyan, and Blaise Pascal. The latest author he mentions, and it should come as no surprise to those who are familiar with C.S. Lewis, is George MacDonald, who died in 1905, about 40 years after On the Reading of Old Books was first published. This is important for me personally because I have decided to take up Lewis's advice. Quote, "It is a good rule, after reading a new book, never to allow yourself another new one until you have read an old one in between. If that is too much for you, you should at least read one old one to every 3 new ones." Today, we would probably consider C.S. Lewis's works to be old, along with the authors whose works he considered at the time new, like those of Reinhold Niebuhr. They certainly wrote in a different day and age than ours, and there's much we can learn from them. Recently, I have read some books from the 1980s, only 30 years ago, that tackles issues that are similar but not the same as the issues we are facing today. When you think about technological changes, social changes, political changes, even geographical changes, the 1980s seem like an old world compared to today. Remember that in the 1980s, the Cold War was still going on. Heavy metal was flourishing. There was no gay marriage. 9/11 hadn't happened yet. The internet barely existed, and certainly not in the form that it does today. The USSR hadn't collapsed yet, and Germany was still divided into 2 different countries. So maybe 30 years should be the starting point for what's considered an old book. Or perhaps I should err on the side of caution and consider an old book only those that are in the public domain. That concludes my thoughts on C.S. Lewis's On the Reading of Old Books. Have a great day, and may peace be with you.